The evening began like any other. I was standing in my kitchen, stirring a pot of vegetable soup, while the last orange light of sunset disappeared behind the trees. Soft music played from the little radio beside my coffee maker, and for once, the house was completely quiet. Then my phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail. Since retiring, I had stopped feeling obligated to answer every call immediately. But when I saw my daughter Claire's name, I picked up. "Mom, I just wanted to tell you something," she said. Her voice was strangely hurried. "You don't have to come to the lake house this summer. Daniel thinks it would be better if we kept it for immediate family this year." Before I could respond, she added, "Love you. I'll call you later." The call ended. I stood there with the spoon still in my hand. For several seconds, I couldn't process what I'd heard. The lake house? My lake house? I was Eleanor Brooks, 68 years old, a retired registered nurse and a widow. I'd spent more than 30 years taking care of other people. The last thing I expected was to discover that my own daughter believed she could decide when I was allowed to visit my property. I turned off the stove and sat at the kitchen table. Maybe I'd misunderstood her, but deep down, I already knew I hadn't. That house wasn't just another vacation property. It had started as a dream my husband Richard and I shared years ago. Whenever we drove through northern Georgia, we'd pass beautiful lakes and imagine having a small home overlooking the water. Richard used to say, "One day we'll have our own porch by the lake." We never had much money. I worked as a nurse, and Richard had his own career, so our dreams were modest. Then cancer entered our lives. Hospital rooms replaced weekend trips. Medical appointments replaced plans for the future. And eventually, I lost him. After Richard died, I spent months simply trying to figure out how to live alone. Then, one afternoon, I discovered an old notebook filled with his rough sketches of the house we'd once imagined. A porch, large windows, a fireplace, a kitchen filled with sunlight. I cried when I saw those drawings. But eventually, I realized something important. Richard's dream didn't have to disappear just because he was gone. So I used his life insurance, combined with years of savings, and bought 6 acres overlooking Lake Oconee. The deed had one name on it, mine. Every payment came from my accounts. Every construction decision was mine. Every permit carried my signature. The house took nearly 2 years to complete. When I finally unlocked the front door for the first time, there was nobody waiting inside. Yet I didn't feel lonely. I walked from room to room, touching the walls and remembering everything Richard and I had once imagined. When sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, I smiled. "We finally made it," I whispered. I believed that house would become a place where my children and grandchildren would gather for years, and for a while, it did. The first summer was perfect. Claire arrived with Daniel and their children. My son Adam came with his wife, Melissa. The house filled with laughter, food, conversations, and memories. One morning, Claire sat beside me in the kitchen. "Mom, you really did it," she said. "Your dad would have loved this." I smiled. "I built it for both of us." She squeezed my hand. At that moment, I believed our family was closer than ever. I had no idea that the following summer, the same daughter sitting beside me would begin helping someone else take control of the home I had built. And the first warning wouldn't come as an argument. It would come disguised as a simple suggestion, because Daniel had already started imagining the house as his. The first signs were so small that I almost ignored them. During one visit, Daniel stood inside the upstairs guest room and looked around thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "this could make a really nice office." I smiled politely. "Maybe." A few weeks later, he pointed toward a storage room. "That could easily become another bedroom." Again, I said nothing. At the time, his comments seemed harmless. Families talk about houses. People imagine renovations. I didn't want to become the kind of mother who turned every casual remark into a conflict. But slowly, the suggestions became decisions. One weekend, I arrived at the lake house and immediately noticed that the furniture had been rearranged. The chair I loved beside the fireplace had been moved. Photographs had disappeared from the mantel, and the guest room was now Daniel's office. Computer monitors covered the desk. Filing cabinets filled the corner. Business folders were stacked neatly on shelves. Nobody had asked me. Claire noticed my expression. Oh, Daniel thought this arrangement made more sense. I forced a smile. It's fine, but it wasn't. Then other things began changing. My gardening tools disappeared from the shed because Daniel wanted room for fishing equipment. The kitchen cabinets were reorganized. Family schedules began revolving around Daniel's preferences. If he had a work call, everyone was expected to keep quiet. If he wanted breakfast later, breakfast happened later. Even the grandchildren were sometimes told to stay farther from the house because Daniel wanted peace. The house I had built to bring everyone together was slowly being reorganized around one person's convenience. Then Claire replaced the curtains. I stared at the new ones. What happened to the blue curtains? They looked old, she said. These make the room brighter. I nodded, but inside something finally clicked. This wasn't about curtains. It wasn't about furniture. It wasn't even about the fishing equipment. It was about control. My choices were disappearing one by one. Near the end of summer, the conversation finally became impossible to ignore. We were sitting outside while the grandchildren skipped stones across the lake. Daniel leaned back and said casually, "You know, we spend more time here than anyone else." I looked at him. He continued, "So maybe it makes sense to treat this as our permanent family vacation place." I asked, "What exactly does that mean?" He shrugged. "Nothing dramatic. We're already here most weekends. You don't really use it that much." Claire quietly nodded. "I think he just means it would be practical." There was that word again, practical. I folded my hands. This house isn't about what's convenient. Neither of them responded. Claire eventually gave me a nervous smile. "Of course it's still your house, Mom." She said the words, but somehow they didn't sound convincing anymore. That night, everyone went upstairs. I stayed outside alone. The lake was completely still. The porch lights reflected across the water, and the night air was cool against my face. For the first time, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I went to bed wondering how things had changed so much without me realizing it. Then 3 days later, something arrived in the mail, a plain white envelope. My name was typed across the front. Inside was a letter from an attorney I'd never met. I read it once, then again. It explained that Claire and Daniel wanted to discuss transferring ownership of the lake house into their names. They described it as a simple way to protect the property for future generations. But the message underneath the polite language was obvious. They expected me to give them my house. I placed the letter on the kitchen table. My hands were perfectly still. I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned, because nobody asks a person to surrender something unless they believe that person might actually say yes. And whoever had written that letter clearly believed I would. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. But the letter wasn't the worst part. The worst part was waiting for me at the front door. 3 days after receiving the attorney's letter, I drove to the lake house without telling anyone. The road was familiar. For years that drive had made me happy. This time, I felt a heaviness I couldn't explain. When I arrived, everything looked peaceful. The flowers were blooming. The porch swing moved gently in the breeze. The lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. From outside, nothing seemed wrong. I walked toward the front door, reached into my purse, pulled out my key, and inserted it into the lock. It wouldn't turn. I tried again. Nothing. For a moment, I wondered if I'd accidentally grabbed the wrong key. I checked my key ring. It was the correct one. I tried once more. Still nothing. Then I noticed the lock itself. It had been replaced. Someone had changed the locks on my house without asking me. I immediately called Claire. She answered quickly. "Hi, Mom. My key doesn't work." There was silence. Then she said, "Oh, right. Daniel had the locks changed last week." "Why?" "For security." I stared at the door. "Security from whom?" She sighed. "Mom, it's not a big deal." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It becomes a big deal when the owner can't get inside." She went quiet. "I meant to tell you, but you didn't." Another silence. "We can get you another key," she finally said. I didn't answer. I simply walked back to my car. I sat behind the steering wheel and looked at the house. My house. The house I'd paid for. The house I'd built after losing my husband. And now I couldn't enter it. I wasn't crying. I wasn't screaming. I was thinking. Suddenly, every warning sign became clear. The rearranged furniture, the missing photographs, the new office, the changed curtains, the conversations about our vacation home, the attorney's letter, and now the locks. This wasn't an accident. This was a pattern. They weren't confused about who owned the property. They simply believed they could push me aside. When I returned home, I opened a cabinet in my office and pulled out a large blue folder. Inside were years of paperwork, the purchase agreement, the deed, construction records, building permits, bank statements, insurance documents. I spread everything across the dining room table. Every document confirmed the same thing. Eleanor Brooks, sole owner, no joint ownership, no transfer agreement, no trust giving Claire or Daniel control. Nothing. For months, I'd been protecting my daughter's feelings. Now I decided to protect myself. That evening, I called Claire. I was thinking about spending this weekend at the lake. She hesitated. "This weekend might be difficult." "Why?" "We already have plans." "How about next weekend?" Another pause. "I'll have to ask Daniel." Those words hurt more than I expected. "I'll have to ask Daniel." My daughter wasn't asking the owner anymore. She was asking the man who had started acting like the owner. I ended the call politely. Then I sat in silence. By midnight, I opened my laptop. I searched for real estate agents near Lake Oconee. The next morning, I made an appointment. A woman named Linda Carter arrived a few days later. She walked through the house carefully, taking notes and examining every room. Eventually, we stood together on the back porch. "You've taken very good care of this property," she said. "I've tried." She looked toward the lake. "The market is strong. If you decide to sell, I don't think it will stay listed very long." I looked at the water. "I don't want a long process." She studied my face. Did something happen? I smiled faintly. Let's just say I'm ready for a new chapter. She didn't ask anything else. The next Monday, the listing went live. Within 24 hours, Linda called. We already have multiple showings. Then came another call. There's an offer, then another, and one buyer was offering cash. I stared at the documents. For years, that house represented my family. Now suddenly, I realized it could represent something else. Freedom. I signed the papers, but I had no idea what would happen when Claire discovered what I'd done, because the next phone call would leave my daughter completely speechless. The sale moved faster than I expected. Linda found several interested buyers almost immediately, but one offer stood out. It was a clean cash offer with very few conditions and a short closing timeline. I accepted it. Not because I wanted the highest possible price, because I wanted certainty. I didn't want another argument. I didn't want another family meeting. And most importantly, I didn't want anyone interfering before the transaction was complete. The closing took place in a small conference room near the courthouse. Stacks of documents sat in front of me. The attorney explained every page carefully. Once these documents are recorded, ownership will officially transfer. I understand. Are you signing voluntarily? Yes, I signed Eleanor Brooks. One final time. When the last document was notarized, the attorney smiled. Congratulations, I thanked him. But as I walked outside, I realized the word didn't quite fit. Freedom felt more accurate. A week later, the sale was officially complete. The money appeared in my account. I looked at the balance briefly and closed the app. The money wasn't what mattered. Peace was. For the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling like someone was waiting for me to surrender something. I returned to my normal routine. Morning walks, gardening, reading on the patio, quiet dinners. And I didn't call Claire. She didn't call me. The silence was strange, but it was also peaceful. Then, the following Saturday afternoon, my phone began ringing repeatedly. 3 missed calls, then 4, then 6. Finally, I answered. Mom! Claire sounded frightened. What happened? They're moving furniture into the house. I frowned. What house? The lake house. I knew immediately. They're saying they bought the property. I took a breath. That is correct. Silence. What do you mean? I sold it. Another long pause. You sold the lake house? Yes. You didn't tell us. It was my property. But we've been staying there? I know. We had plans. So did I. Her voice cracked. Mom, why would you do this? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I simply reminded her of everything that had happened. When you told me I shouldn't come to my own house, I said nothing. She became quiet. When your attorney sent me paperwork asking me to transfer ownership, I still said nothing. No response. And when I arrived at the house and discovered the locks had been changed without my permission, I stopped. Claire didn't speak. You had already made your decision, I continued. You were treating the house as if it belonged to you. Her breathing became heavier. Mom, we never thought you'd actually sell it. I closed my eyes. I know. Those 3 words said everything. They had assumed I'd always be there. They assumed I'd tolerate every boundary they crossed. They assumed family meant I would never act. But they had forgotten something important. Love doesn't require surrender. Being a mother doesn't mean giving your children control over everything you've worked for. And sometimes the strongest response isn't an argument. It's a decision. Claire finally asked, "So what happens now?" I looked out the window at my quiet backyard. "You'll have to speak with the new owners." She didn't answer. For the first time, there was nothing left for her to negotiate. But there was still one thing I hadn't told her. The money from the sale wasn't going toward another vacation house. It was going somewhere she would never have expected. And when she discovered what I planned to do with it, the story would take one final turn.